So, welcome to our final panel session of the 15th Nuffield Trust Annual Summit. We've had so much lovely feedback about the event, so thank you already. And don't feel like there's any pressure on us to keep the standards up, but really pleased to be here this lunchtime to talk about one of the questions that does seem to have kept recurring in our discussions over the last 48 hours, which is whether or not we can ever change the centralised culture of the NHS. So one of the things that Nigel said when he was speaking yesterday was that the English NHS is probably the largest and most centralised health system in the developed world, with the possible exception of North Korea. And we've been trying to change this for some time. So we've known that this has been an issue for some time. If you go back 10 years, we had the Francis Report, and the Francis Report highlighted the sometimes dysfunctional relationship between providers and regulators and commissioners. And yet, just this week, in his interview with Sean Linton that we published yesterday, Robert Francis said that the culture has not changed very much over the years. There's still a lot of top-down control and command type stuff happening, with chief execs feeling they're being persecuted. David Nick also said that NHS chief execs needed to be able to look out, not up. 2016, give or take, when Susie and I were working together in NHS Improvement, we produced, or Susie led the production of Developing People Improving Care, with a real focus on compassionate leadership. And yet, we still find the experiences that people have been describing over the last 48 hours. But it's all going to change, because we have a new operating framework for NHS England. And the operating framework says, the establishment of ICSs and the new statutory framework requires a cultural and behavioural shift towards partnership-based working, creating NHS policy, strategy, priorities and delivery solution with national partners and with system stakeholders, and giving system leaders the agency and autonomy to identify the best way to deliver agreed priorities in their local context. And we have a great panel today to talk to us about how that's going to happen. So let me introduce Patricia Miller, who's the Chief Executive of the ICS in Dorset, Owen Williams, Chief Executive of the Northern Care Alliance, and stepping in at the last minute for his boss, who's probably unfortunate for her as well as unfortunate for us, being called to an urgent meeting in London. We have Chris Hopson, the Director of Strategy for NHS England. So you've probably all had the same experience that I've had when I was working in a local system, where you get senior leaders sitting around a table with each other, talking the talk about doing things differently and about their relationships and about how organisations needed to work in collaboration, absolutely meaning it, walking out the door and nothing happens, doesn't change. So my first question to all of you, and one by one, is why do you think that is? What is it that gets in the way of that culture shift? And in your different roles, what do you think you personally can do about it? Patricia, do you want to kick us off?
I think some of what gets in the way is whether we've got the right people in the right roles at a senior level who really want to collaborate. So if I think about the NHS over the last 20 years, the previous Health and Care Act quite deliberately introduced an environment and a culture of competition. And what we need now is partnership and collaboration. And we might need to accept that some leaders that are in some of the most senior roles are actually not able to do that because it's not part of their makeup, it's not the reason why they were recruited in the first place. I think the second issue for me is that and I think the operating framework, while it has good intentions behind it, is a perfect example of where we think that change is all about structure, it's all about process, and it's all about transaction. And when we look at first, second and third order change, actually what we recognise is the biggest lever to change is recognising how we need to change as individuals in leadership roles in order to facilitate the change that needs to happen. And we don't spend enough time focusing on that, understanding what that means, and then working through what the development is that gets us from where we are now to where we need to be. I also think we see change as a process, and actually it isn't. Culture is developed one conversation at a time, And if we really want to change the culture of where the NHS operates now in this new environment of integrated care, then we have to change the conversations. And for NHS England, that means changing the conversations from being about micromanagement, about the delivery of targets, about telling everyone the detail of go right, turn left, then do a U-turn, and not recognising the freedom and autonomy of leadership at a senior level that brings something different, and that is why people get into those roles. So the conversation between the senior leadership and ICS chief executives, it needs to change. The context within which it happens needs to change. What we're asked to do needs to change if we're going to make this monumental shift that the NHS needs to make in this new environment, from being a service that looks after people when they're unwell to one that keeps them healthy for as long as possible.
Thanks, Patricia. Chris, I'll come to you last. But Owen, what's your thoughts on that?
Gosh, that's a deep question. I think the first thing I'd look in that example you gave around people sat around a room having a really good conversation. I think the first thing, if we're looking to maybe change that, the first thing I would do is look at myself, actually. And maybe just ask myself the question, what might I need to consider doing differently? Am I just bringing the usual Owen to the conversation with my usual thought processes, my biases, my prejudices, and am I actually playing into this slipstream? So I think that's the first thing I would do. I would also say to the sort of central question we'll come to discuss on that I probably live in a world of reality, and I'll just give you a scenario. So we've got in the Northern Care Alliance covering the areas of Salford, Bury, Oldham, Rochdale. I'm conscious for anybody north of Watford they may be not familiar with. But yes, it covers that area. And we have 20,138 colleagues currently working with us. They are secondary care clinicians, doctors, nurses, therapists, GPs, social care workers. They're all a part of that organisation. Of that 20,138, 4,494 of them are Black, Asian, minority, ethnic colleagues. And of that number of colleagues, 35% of them live in what we would call indices of multiple deprivation, number one. So that's most deprived. Okay, so just to think about that. And I know as a leader that I can absolutely latch that little statement, that set of facts, to the two previous agenda items we've discussed this morning. Because within that conversation is, for example, the role that people might play in communities as colleagues. Yeah, I never do the patients, you know, and I always talk about patient and colleague well-being as one. But our colleagues are also parts of the community. So just think about what I've just said, and I can see a few people thinking, gosh, he knows numbers and whatever else. Now, as I turn to my colleague to the left, do you think that Chris can walk into Minister Barclay's office and have that conversation? Do you really think, would we really expect Chris to be grounded in that as a conversation? If the answer to that in your head is yes, it should be, then part of what I would say, and some of this is linked to my local government background as well as my NHS background, is you probably need a bit of work around the reality of politics and what it's like being in the interface with a politician. I see Sir Stephen Dorrell here as well, and a few other colleagues. So what am I making with that point? I think there's a thing about getting realistic about what the expectations are of people that work in the quote-unquote centre, and maybe realise what's my responsibility as a leader, what can I affect, that data I've talked about, how can I make that work, how can I work in collaboration with my system partners, voluntary and community sector, so on and so forth, to make some of that work, and be realistic about the expectation of what I might expect from the centre or otherwise.
Thanks, Owen. So Chris, Owen is being realistic in his expectations of you. What can he expect?
Thanks, Helen. Look, can I say two things to start with? First of all, I'm sorry I'm not Amanda. And she offers her apologies. And secondly, if you don't mind, may I just give a small personal thank you to Mr. Edwards, who effectively, I think, has quite rightly been described as a national treasure. And I think he's done an amazing job leading the Trust. And I think the Trust has been a key part of the thought leadership in the health and social care community. And I think it's done an absolutely fantastic job. And I was just thinking of that little game of what's the one sentence that I would use to sum up Nigel. Nigel, I think you are an evidence-based, insightful, contrarian grit in the oyster that is much needed. And just, you know, from a personal basis, both in my current role and my previous role, thank you very, very much for all that you've done. It's been fantastic, and we look forward.
And to the question?
I'm delighted to hear, as I bumped into you going to the loo, that you're not completely disappearing. I think the answer to the question, Owen, thank you so much for what you said, because it's a perfect segue in, which is I do think, and you know, it's interesting how one's perspective shifts according to the job that you do. But one of the things that I think is...
We might come back to that.
The thing that I think is just particularly interesting is what I think kind of really comes home when you sit at NHS England is the consequences of being in a taxpayer-funded national health service. And interesting thing about taxation in this country is, I think I'm right in saying, and the experts in the audience may contradict me, is that actually, if you look at where our tax gets raised, we are the worst is probably the wrong way of describing it, but in terms of looking at European nations, we are the one that raise by far the most taxation at a national level compared to a regional or a local level. And you do have £140 billion coming to NHS England of taxpayers' money, where effectively politicians are ultimately accountable to Parliament for the spending of that money, and quite understandably politicians will want to ensure that they can set the strategic direction of the service and hold the service to account for the spending of that money, though obviously we have a direct relationship in NHS England to Parliament, and that's set out clearly in statute. And all I'm saying, I think, Owen, is, and I think in a way it's a slightly different way of what you're saying, is that when you ask Helen of what are the barriers to effectively having a more decentralised system, I think that fundamental kind of statutory structure in which we are a national taxpayer-funded service led by national politicians does create a limit, in a sense, to how far you can go. Having said all of that, we have said, and I'm sure we'll explore this over the next 55 minutes, is we're very clear at NHS England, we set that out in the operating framework, that the creation of integrated care systems gives us a fantastic opportunity to change the nature of the relationship between NHS England and the front line. And we're very, very clear that we need to change as an organisation. We need to change the way that we lead to give ICSs the space to lead in the way that they need to. And, you know, we can talk in a bit more detail later about some of the things that we are doing in a very concrete way to make sure that that is going to happen.
Can you give us an example?
Well, yes, so if you want to delve into a bit of detail, a very obvious example would be the way that we did the winter planning, where effectively what we did was we said very, very clearly at NHS England, we set a national level strategic framework. We identified that extra capacity was needed in the system, but we were completely clear that each individual integrated care system would want to come up with its own plan of how that extra capacity was going to be added based on, did it want to create extra hospital capacity? Did it want to create extra step-up, step-down capacity? A whole bunch of different options. We very specifically said to local integrated care systems, it is up to you to draw up your local plan with the detailed metrics of where you're going to spend the extra funding that we're provided to actually provide the increased performance over winter. We then said that because it's our job, we need to ensure appropriate accountability. We again very deliberately co-designed with ICSs, with ICBs, a board assurance framework to enable ICB boards to ensure that those plans were being delivered. And then effectively we have taken the information that's come through that board assurance framework, and that is the way that we are assuring. And there, it seems to me, are 2 or 3 or 4 key principles there. The first is that we should be setting the national framework, but secondly, it is absolutely up to ICBs to determine the detail of how their money is going to be spent and where they wish to spend it. We do need to hold ICBs to account because we need to account for the 140 billion. And effectively, the way to do that is by co-designing together what that assurance framework looks like and ensuring there is a single reporting framework which effectively the local ICB board can use and we can use. Now, I would argue, and we've had very positive feedback from ICB leaders, that actually that is the appropriate way that we should be working together going forward. And just to make the point that had we not done that work, we've had an incredibly difficult winter, which I know you've already been talking about, but it would have been a lot worse had we not done that work in close collaboration with ICBs over the period between August and November, and then delivering that plan December, January, February, March.
Thanks, Chris. So, Patricia, you've moved from being a hospital leader to being an ICS leader. How did it feel to be in that, what you might describe as the squeeze middle, to be between NHS England and your provider colleagues? And you might want to reflect on the example Chris has given about the winter planning process. How do you balance getting the right relationships with your partners in the local system with also being able to deliver the national priorities?
It's a very different environment. And actually, what I would say to Chris is, whilst there was co-production on the winter plan, I really struggled with why NHS England felt the need to tell ICBs what we need in an assurance framework. Because when I was sat in a foundation trust, running a foundation trust, they would have never come to me and said, we need to talk about what your assurance framework looked like. There would have been an implicit expectation and trust that a leader at my level would be able to develop that and give them assurance. So I think the fundamental difference that I've found is I think there is a lack of freedom, and wherever that comes from, whether it's confidence or respect, there is a lack of freedom for leaders to act and trust that they will do the right thing. And the level of instruction and the level of detail that comes with that far exceeds what would have happened and happens every day to foundation trust leaders.
So we've got a little way to go before getting that agency and autonomy that the operating framework.
Yeah, so I'll give you an example. When we were establishing the ICB, the level of detail that came down that said, how do you set your board up? How do you write your constitution? How do you write your operating model? Even down to, can we sign off your job descriptions for your executive adverts? I felt like if we need that level of intervention, then I might as well be a band 7. I know how to write a chief officer job description. You know, and I think all that came from a good place of wanting things to be consistent, but didn't recognise the seniority of leaders, the experience that they bring to those roles, and the fact that some of that stuff they can actually do really well.
So I'm going to build on something that Owen mentioned, actually. Owen, you mentioned that you started your life in local authorities. What's different about the culture in local authorities and the relationship that local authorities have with their centre that the NHS could perhaps learn from? What advice would you have for leaders, maybe especially hospital leaders, who spent their career in the NHS to help them get the most from their relationship with local authority colleagues?
One of the obvious things for me is a sense of place and locality. I think it was Miriam, I think you made a comment earlier on when you were presenting about, you know, how many local people have knocked on your door and said, just tell me a little bit more about that ICB, will you? Probably doesn't happen that much. And so for me, there's a real thing about understanding place, and I mean really understanding place, not down to geographical boundaries of local authorities, because that's a legacy of 1974. But I'm talking about, the streets that we live in, and really understanding, what might be the different set of circumstances for communities who live in one place and then next door to another community who experience things totally differently. And can we get to a stage where our care, our support, our preventative type activities, whatever it is, can we get to a position where we influence there if, and I use the word if, communities actually want us to help? Because there's sometimes just a working assumption that they need our help, which I think is something that... You see what I'm talking now? That's what local government gives you as a thought process. I think part of what Chris was describing, and particularly if you are an NHS leader, manager, and I think there's a question mark about the degree to which we have got NHS leaders versus highly paid managers. There is a distinction, certainly in my head, around some of that. But if you are brought up in the model where it is always about looking upwards, I don't know if people have seen, I can't remember what it's called, I think it's called the NHS Bermuda Triangle, and it kind of has this thing of different layers of leadership in the NHS, or I would say managership in the NHS, and say if you are taught to look upwards all the time, guess what? That's what you tend to do. So for me, and I know it seems like a few months ago since the Gordon Messenger review came out, and I know not everybody was in love with the Gordon Messenger review, but I would urge you to go back and have a look. Because actually I think at least the central point about focusing on leadership development is somewhere where we stay in this. If we can focus on that, I think we've got an opportunity to make a breakthrough on some of these cultural challenges. And so I want people, I read Japanese manga comics for my sins, and one of the things that it talks about is the ability to look left and right at the same time. For me, that's about the ability to look at place, but also to understand what are the national vertical imperatives that sometimes come down, and having leaders who can deal with the complexity of both.
Yeah.
But if you don't pay attention to leadership, okay, and I think that is one of the differences alongside place between local government and the NHS, you probably end up right about where we are now, where guess what? We've just discovered that our colleagues matter. Shock horror. Who would have guessed that?
Thanks, Owen. I've got a question for Chris in a second, but after Chris's response to my question, I'm going to open it up so you can be getting your thoughts ready. So, Chris, you said yourself, it's funny how things change over the years. A year ago, you would have been sitting here in a very different capacity. What advice is old Chris giving new Chris about the way in which national strategy operates in this world?
It's not quit, is it?
That's a bit of a mean one, Helen.
No, it's not. It's fine. It's fine. So the answer is they are very, very different roles. And effectively, I am a member of the executive team that leads NHS England and therefore, by extension, the NHS. And the activities and the things that I say publicly, for example, can perfectly legitimately be reported and taken as the words of NHS England, which is a statutory organisation that needs to have the appropriate partnership with all of the different parts of kind of government. If I'm really honest, Helen, my basic views about what we need to do as a service haven't changed. It's just, one of the things that, when you do change into a role like this is that by definition you have to kind of change what you can say publicly and how you say it. Can I just pick up on Owen's point? Because I think for me, you talk about facing left and facing right at the same time. And I think for me, what that stimulated in my mind is I couldn't agree with you more about the need to ensure that we decentralise as much as possible, collaborate, listen to our community, communities, all of the things that you were talking about. But my observation would be the difference between, one of the key differences between local government and the NHS is funding flow, governance and accountability. And like it or not, in a public service, those things are really important. And at a local level, you have local political leadership that effectively is elected every 4 years and has to respond to local needs. You can raise extra money or not raise extra money through the community, is it called the council tax these days, isn't it? Through the council tax. And effectively, you have the ability to therefore, change things in a way where in this system for the NHS, you have 140 billion pounds that flows through NHS England. We have to account for that, and it is national politicians who inevitably will place significant emphasis on the consistency, I think that word has already come up, in terms of a national health service with some priorities that they wish to determine. And therefore, as I said, governance, accountability, top-level strategic direction and funding are fundamentally different. Now, we'll all have very strong views about which of the two we would prefer. All I'm saying is the reality is that is how our current kind of system works. So in terms of facing left and facing right, it's how do we get all of the things that you're talking about, which I think we're all committed to delivering, but recognising that we have some interesting kind of, funding flow, structure, accountability and governance requirements that we also have to meet.
I would agree with most of that with two exceptions. One, that when we're constantly looking upwards, we're not looking down to the people that we are absolutely accountable to, which are our communities.
Agreed.
And that's a fundamental change that we've got to make through ICSs. And we need to recognise that. And whilst local government, we talk about the fact that health has an accountability framework, I still think local government has an accountability framework, it's just slightly different. And so we've got to recognise that. And actually one of the challenges we've got moving forward is how do we bring partners closer together in terms of the shared purpose and how we operate. But the biggest change that I think we need to make is when Owen talks about looking left and right and spending most of our time looking upwards, we miss the fact we're accountable to communities. And the second thing I would say is that absolutely recognise that government tells us what it wants its priorities to do. What we get more of, though, is how to deliver them. And that's something else that fundamentally needs to change, because if we're going to be receptive to the lived experience of our communities, understand their barriers to achieving good health and well-being, and work with them to co-design the solutions, a central top-down approach of how is not going to work.
Thanks, Patricia. Owen?
I think what I was going to...
No, that went down well.
I think what I was going to probably just say is that, first of all, Chris, I suspect, and I know you didn't mean this, but I suspect if there were local government colleagues listening to how you described some of that, they may have unintentionally heard something that said, well, that life's pretty straightforward then.
No, not at all. Not at all. And Sarah is sitting there, and I know she knows I know it's not.
I was just wanting to, speaking to Chris 1 or 2, I just wanted to make sure that we were in the right space on that one, because...
Agreed.
But I think what I'm talking about is call it intersectional leadership then. What the hell does that mean? What that means is, if you understand that in a local government context since 2008, 2007, 2008, if you look at the resources for local government, I mean, it's just been awful. And you don't take my word for it.
Absolutely.
Look at the National Audit Office. It will tell you the story about that change. So as hard as we have it in the NHS,
Agreed.
Our story on that journey, they're different stories.
Yeah.
And actually, the skill set that sits at place and trying to manage that reality when actually residents, constituents' expectations are going the other way, as in higher, more demanding, more diverse, more nuanced, means that you need to have at that intersectional point then. So I see myself as at that intersectional point whereby I'm working with 4 local authority areas, for argument's sake. I can get down to lower areas if we want to, super output areas and stuff like that. But that's what I've got in my mind. But at the same time, I know that we are a soft 3 or single oversight framework 3 organisation. Okay, we're a tier 1 in terms of backlog recovery, where it requires improvement in terms of the CQC. But I see it as my job, working with my partners, to do that bridging. Because that regulatory thing, that way that works, is probably not going to change in my lifetime. Okay, so what can I do as a leader? And that's why I keep coming back to the leadership point. Are we evolving and developing not just the leaders of now, but where's the next leadership generation? I was speaking to the colleague, I was looking at the colleague from West Yorkshire there, and I was thinking, you know, where's that person going to be in, you know, 10 years' time? You know, the 2 colleagues he talked about who are thinking of leaving, well, for goodness sake, we don't want them to leave because we want to develop them into the next leaders of the future. But if that's not exciting, if it's drudgery, if leadership feels like it's going to be some sort of ball and chain that you have to carry around, that's not where we want to be. So I'm going to keep being a bit repetitive here. Leadership development is crucial. And I'm not just on about Bevan stuff. Talking about common purpose, broader view type leadership.
Our leadership task, by the way, Owen, is precisely to do a much better job of aligning soft tiering and CQC, and we recognise that's one of our leadership challenges.
Thanks, Chris. My challenge now is to go to the audience. Now, 3 people have caught my eye already, but I'm going to take a leaf out of Julian's book and get the next 3 lined up as well. So I'm going to start with Becky, Sam, and Richard Douglas. So if you can put your hands up so that the people with the microphone know to go to you. And then can I have hands up for the next round of questions? I'm going to go to Sarah Pickup, I'm going to go to Juliet Bouverie, and I'm going to go to Laura Donnelly. So start with Becky, Sam, and Richard. We'll answer those questions, and then we'll go to, what did I just say? I said Sarah, Nadeem, and Laura.
My question builds on Chris's comments about the consequences of having a centrally funded 140 billion budget, and Nigel's comments yesterday about social insurance looking quite like a tax anyway. So my question is it time to think about swapping to a social insurance system as a way of challenging the entrenched centralisation? And I can hear the collective kind of indrawing of breath in the room with everybody going, oh my God, not that zombie again. But I would question then, go back to Owen's opening comments, should we be challenging ourselves to really think about whether we should think differently?
Thank you. Sam?
64 million.
Sam Evington, GP, chair of the CCG for 10 years. So I feel very sorry for Chris in many ways, because his wild side of the past has to be controlled, and he has to be held responsible for actually what's gone on historically. So I just wanted to focus a bit on that, because it's the historic context of what's happened, particularly in the recent last 2 to 3 years, which actually is impacting on a lot of the conversations. We were restructured under COVID. 7 CCGs went to 1. That was devastating. Driven by Simon Stevens, by the way. Really extraordinary. I've never seen a restructuring in the NHS not driven by a minister. And then a year of restructuring. I was ready to hand over the CCG to the incoming chair who was appointed, but it wasn't accepted. I recognised my terminality and said, actually, take over and I'll support you. Instead, we had a year of governance discussions and people jockeying for position. It was a disaster. And in the context of that, losing a lot of corporate memory in the process. The key thing, when I was chair at Tower Hamlets CCG, what was really powerful in transformational terms was actually clinicians, patients, and managers working together. And I'd never seen that, actually, before in the NHS. This was really new. All of that has, I think, been lost by what I would almost see as a management, an NHSE takeover, actually, of the system. And that is tragic, because actually, when you see clinicians not engaged in financial management, population management, and system management, you're missing a trick. And that, to me, has been the devastating effect, and I don't see that being turned around. I see at least a loss of 25% clinical leadership from primary care, and I'm not convinced that on the clinical side in the hospital hasn't ever been deeply involved. And so therein lies your solutions. And the other point I wanted to make was my CEO kept on saying to me, her role is to manage up. And I remember actually one of the key roles for me was to go in NHSE meetings and change the dialogue. Because I knew if I went in, the behaviour changed. It's a bit like when you bring patients into conversations with doctors, the behaviour changes. So that's the historic context, which is really difficult, Chris, because you would be against all of that. Unfortunately, you can't say that.
I'm going to hurry you up, Sam, because we've got lots of other people want to come in.
Three very quick things I want you to think about, Chris. Please stop the spinning from the top, okay? These things that come out on Sunday Times, have the respect to the staff in the NHS to at least inform them at the same time. Secondly, stop this top-down. When I was in an interview with Richard, your chair, I said to him, I'd spoken to a medical director the day before, she'd been sent 80 priorities from the digital side of NHSE. You can hear people laughing. This is what happens all the time. You have to deal with what's actually happening rather than actually what you say you don't want to happen. This nonsense has to stop. And finally, please, 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 stop releasing. I get tons of secret papers, confidential. Why? What the hell's going on? The taxpayer pays for this stuff. They have a right to see it unless it's absolutely confidential, commercial, or it's about patients. So there's 3 ideas for you.
Thanks, Sam. Richard? Right over there in the middle.
Richard Douglas, Chair of the South East London ICB and a past civil servant, so I'm sort of a bit used to your world. And first of all, there's got to be an acceptance of what Chris says about a nationally funded system with national political leadership needs national accountability, and that's a given in all of this. It's basically then how do you discharge that? And I guess interestingly, the one attempt in my civil service life to really change this centralised culture was done by a chap called Andrew Lansley, you might remember him. And we were never going to interfere politically. There would be no operational interference in the NHS ever again at that point. Now, we sort of all know how that worked out. So we've tried that very hands-off, regulated market approach. And we're now in this position of how do we make something quite different work without it being a centralised top-down system. And I guess there's a couple of observations I'd make. And the first is that we do all have some agency in this. You know, we're not just passive recipients of stuff that comes down to us, whether it's at a local level or at a national level. So I think at a national level, Chris, my observation would be you've sort of got to a position where you've confused accountability with the illusion of control. And what you do is, and this has been coming for about 6 or 7 years. It's been coming since I left, by the way. But this belief that by collecting a lot of spreadsheets and templates with lots and lots of detail on, you're in control of stuff, and you're not. You know, it gives comfort, and it allows you to totter off to people and say, look, I know these numbers and things, but actually it don't give you any control whatsoever. And I think there is just something about how, as a national body, you rethink your operating model, not in terms of numbers of priorities or objectives, but how do we account for what we do? And I think we account for what we do by having the right leadership in place at a local level and actually supporting them. So I'd take very much Patricia's view. If we carry on the way as we are now, you might as well have a load of administrators out in the system just filling forms and send them back up to you. But there is something as well, I think, about agency at an ICS level. And there's something about how we see ourselves as ICSs. So I think Helen referred to the squeezed middle. The last thing I want to be is a bit of a squeezed middle. Yeah, we've got to define ourselves as something that is not an SHA or any other intermediate tier we've had before. It is a genuine partnership of local organisations. And I think that the trick for me, and I don't know how we all pull this off, is creating a different centre of gravity for an ICS. So we get, at an executive level, you will get a pull towards the NHS leadership team, towards ministers, that executive line. We've also got this thing called integrated care partnerships. And the thing to me has been, I want my team to feel as accountable to that integrated care partnership as they are to NHS England. And if we pull off that trick, then we can sort of change this centralised culture.
Thanks, Richard. So from Richard and Sam, we've got quite a lot in there about having agency and how we use clinical leadership and back to our earlier conversation, perhaps patient leadership to change the dial. Owen, Patricia, you'd like to reflect on either of those?
Can we go first? So I can't comment what happens in other systems, but I can tell you about my system. So we've been quite clear that regardless of the fact we're not a membership organisation anymore, which is what the CCG is, the organisation has to work on the basis of partnership, not just with local government or the third sector and the private sector, but more importantly, a triumvirate of managers, clinicians and community. So we have maintained a clinical leadership structure, and actually we've expanded that so that it not just involves the wider primary care workforce on top of GPs, but also there's a clinical leadership structure that joins that across secondary care. That's to get the broadest level of clinical leadership and representation in the ICS. That was a conscious decision to do that. And that we would see the transformation agenda going forward as a relationship between the managers or leaders across the system, not just within the ICB, and clinicians in the widest sense and the community. When we think about the development of the integrated care strategy, the piece of work that the ICP has led, we've made two conscious decisions in that space. One is that work has and should be led by the Director of Public Health, because the strategy is grounded in health equity and social and economic development being the foundation for making that happen. And the second principle that we agreed is that it should be written by the community, because whilst local government has always been very democratic in the way that it makes decisions, I think we all agree as health officers that the health service has taken a very paternalistic view at times. And actually, if we're going to move to a real, genuine partnership between us as officers across the system for delivery and our community, then it needs to be built with authenticity. So we took the Wigan deal approach. We trained lots of our staff right across health, local government, VCSE to embed themselves in the community over a series of months, and then come back with the intelligence around what the lived experience was like, what people needed from public service to really shift the dial on their health and well-being and their ability to live their best lives. And that has been a fundamental part of putting together the ICP strategy, and that will now be our approach going forward. All of our organisations have agreed to embed that approach. No more consultation unless we absolutely need to in terms of the law. It's about working with communities. It's about developing strategies and services at place with them that will enable them to live the best lives that they possibly can, and make sure that the longer term goal is that our communities thrive, and through that people live a good standard of living and develop personal happiness. And that will take time, but it's important that we shift from the way that we've thought in the past to that new way of working, because without that we're not going to be able to deliver the ambitions of the ICS. Because to me, productivity and access, they're great. personally, I wouldn't have put those as strategic purposes because I think that's the bread and butter of service. We should be doing that anyway. It should be baked in as business as usual. The sweet spot for an integrated care system is how you work in partnership to leverage health equity and do that through the role that you've got in social and economic development and the partnership. And we're really clear that's the principle on which the ICS moves forward, and that's how we're trying to deliver service.
Thanks. Chris, you want to pick up on Rebecca's point about the potential of moving to a social insurance system?
Well,
what that might do to
I'm afraid to say, Helen, this is where Chris 2 needs to come into operation rather than Chris 1, which effectively is that's clearly a matter for government, and that's not a matter on which NHS England would wish to express a view. The point I will make, though, is, which others have made, and I'm merely echoing others, is there is a great danger that at the moment the debate about the NHS model is in danger of focusing on solutions that may not actually improve care, may not bring significant amounts of extra funding, may not increase the amount of the workforce we have, may not make the kind of investments in data and digital that we need to look at. And there is a danger, it feels to me, that arguments around funding models and arguments around fundamental kind of structural change actually seem they are in danger of missing the point, which is actually you're going to get improvements from making changes in the areas that I've talked about. And I think I was talking to, I don't know whether I'm allowed to mention Jennifer Dixon or not, given that I'm at the Nuffield Trust. But effectively, I think...
Bit late now.
Yeah, it is. Jennifer was just making a really interesting point, which effectively is if you just do that comparative analysis kind of across the systems, actually there is nothing to say that, you know, a particular funding model effectively, and I see Nigel is nodding luckily, basically, you know, produces better outcomes. So I fear, echoing others, that it may be a bit of a red herring.
Thanks, Chris. Now, we have just under 20 minutes left, and I'd like to get 2 more rounds of questions if we can. So I did say before Sarah, Juliet and Laura. And then Nadeem also caught my eye, and I know there's a question that's come in from the virtual audience, and then the very final, oh my God, I've got 3 journalists with their hands up. I'm going to go to Mr. Cowper for the very final question. So now, Sarah, Juliet and Laura, and then we'll take those 3 questions and then we'll go to our last 3. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Sarah Pickup, LGA and Nuffield trustee. Chris, you talked about the difference in accountability between local government and the NHS. There's not quite as... I mean, there's clearly a difference, and we manage it every day, but it's not as different as you think. DHSC has social care in its title, as now it didn't, it was always in there. And there are national requirements and national policy around social care as well. And ministers are trying very hard to get us to fill in as many forms as the NHS wants, and issued 3 or 4 different grants as part of this year's local government settlement, forgetting that most of the funding for adult social care comes from council tax and business rates raised locally. And they're also trying to isolate adult social care from the rest of the council's budget as if it doesn't kind of cross-refer. And so there are, there's a national drive on that. It's not the same, but it's there. And the national policy, of course, is that we should all integrate, that we should have integrated care partnerships, and we should work together. And I suppose what I wanted to say was, yes, of course there's an accountability, but accountability is not the same as micromanagement. And so how do you do it? You've got all these really senior people you've appointed into 42 systems, great chairs, great leaders working with their local government partners, VCSA and all the others. You need a really high-level framework of what you want from them, and you want them to convince the government that they're delivering against their... Why do we need to have so many forms and monitors and issues of guidance? Why can't it be higher level? As Patricia said, these are, they know how to do these things. Well, we set up ICSs and then we said, let's do a government review of ICSs. And I think it was first of all going to be compulsory and then it became voluntary but highly encouraged. And there's all these things like you do this and then it's as if we finished that bit of guidance. We need to start writing the next bit of guidance now because what otherwise will we do? So I just think that, yes, accountability, but use what you've got to do it differently. And do think about the fact that, yes, you're accountable to central government. Where does their money come from? It comes from the taxpayer. So at the end of the day, we're all accountable back out to ourselves as taxpayers, and that link to the community is vital. And if we can demonstrate to government we're doing what we should be doing, delivering against keeping people healthier, the objectives of the that have been set out for ICSs, then that should be what people are being held accountable for. And yes, there's some targets perhaps on certain things, but they should be few, because what we're about is the health of the population.
Thanks, Sarah. Juliet.
Hi, thanks. I'm Juliet Bouverie, Chief Executive of the Stroke Association, Chair of the Richmond Group of Charities. I just wanted to reflect on two things. I'm feeling a bit uncomfortable about this local national debate because it's very polarised. It seems to be either it's all local or it's all national. And I think it's not either or, I think it's both and. And one of the sort of conceptual models I try to hold in my head as a chief executive is this one of freedom within a framework. And I think that's potentially what we're talking about here. Lots of freedom, lots of autonomy, but within a framework. So I suppose my first question to the panel is, do you agree with that? And then do you think that national framework is clear and consistent enough? Because I think it's flip-flopping. 1 minute it's the NHS long-term plan, then it's the 5-year major conditions strategy, then it's something else. And I think that national framework is confusing. So that's my first reflection. And then my second reflection is, I have to say I work all the time in partnership with NHS England. I co-chair the Stroke Delivery Board with NHS England. The Stroke Association does loads of partnership projects. We make it work because I see it very much as my job to build the relationships. But I have to say there's a complete culture clash between the voluntary sector embracing a culture of trust and empowerment and NHS England, dare I say it, having a culture of control and risk aversion. And there is a real tension there. So I suppose my question, and it maybe is directed to Chris, is do you agree that NHS England could have a stronger culture of trust and empowerment? And empowerment means ceding power, sharing power, giving power away. If you do agree with that, what are some of the leadership behaviours that are needed to facilitate that culture change?
Lovely question. Thanks, Julia. And we'll go to Laura with the final question. Are you ready to respond?
Hi. Yeah, this one is a question for Chris. With the anticipated strikes coming up by junior doctors a week on Monday, I just wanted to ask how concerned you are and what concerns are sort of focused on, how much activity you think we'll see being stopped over that period, and also how much information NHSE is getting from the BMA in order to sort of plan around what looks like perhaps the most extreme action we've seen yet.
Thanks, Laura. So, Chris, obviously quite a few of these questions posed to you, but I'm actually going to ask Owen to come in as well. Just before you answer, to weave them together a little bit, and some really interesting questions there about the framework within NHS England operates and how it manages the cultures. And to build on Laura's question, not only to think about responding to exactly what she said, but actually also how you work with leaders in the system as they are managing the strikes on a very real day-to-day basis. What does that mean for NHS England's role?
Okay, so can I just also pick up Sarah's question, which is, Sarah, you'll know, for example, from the work that both our organisations were doing around accounting for the 500 million discharge funding and then the £200 million discharge funding, about the requirements that ministers sometimes have when they effectively allocate funding about how they want local systems to account for how that money is being spent. And all I'm saying is the reason I was stressing the kind of national framework bit is because a significant amount of the requests that we make as NHS England to ICBs are actually driven by the nature of that relationship. Julia, I couldn't agree more. That I thought you described it really well, if I may say so. The idea of kind of freedom within a framework, which is what we've tried to do in terms of setting out the operating model that we have done and the operating framework that we've done. We've tried to make that clear. I do recognise that the overall strategic framework One of our challenges, one of our requirements is to work closely with our colleagues in government, and I kind of recognise that having, you know, as much alignment as possible is really, really important. And just to give you a couple of examples of kind of the leadership behaviours that I think, you know we need to exhibit, a really good example would be that we've talked a lot about partnership, which I think is really important. We at NHS England are really keen to work in very, very close partnership with our ICB chief executives. We have a monthly meeting. I chaired on Tuesday a face-to-face meeting with 40 of the 42 ICB CEOs, with all of my executive colleagues in the room, and we spent a half day having a really good quality interactive discussion about where we are in the kind of current planning process. And those are the kind of things, to be frank, that we really haven't done before. And I think one of the observations I would make is the opportunity to work with 42 ICBs as opposed to 230 CCGs, 220 providers does create a different dynamic. But, you know, please judge us. We're on a journey. We're all on a journey here. You know, please judge us by how we behave and how we work over the next year. But that is our very clear intention. Laura, I'm glad you asked the question about strikes, because I do think it's really important to recognise that were the BMA strikes to go ahead, then they will be greater in scale than we've seen before. All NHS organisations, provider organisations, have junior doctors, so it will be a bigger and a wider spread. The impact will be greater on the NHS. For example, half of all GP practices actually have trainees. It will last longer in terms of it will be for 72 hours. The BMA have said publicly that they think it's unlikely that there will be national level derogations, which, as you know, have been really important in terms of managing, for example, the nursing strike. And we know that there will be greater numbers of staff involved. It will be just under half of our medical workforce, so 61,000 junior doctors. We're doing everything that we can. The bit that obviously we're concerned about is not only the impact on urgent and emergency care, but also the impact in terms of the 78-week elective target that you were, I think, kind of implying. We are actually doing, I think, really pretty well on that. We've cut the the remaining list by a quarter over the last month. And if you look at the trajectory where we were before Christmas, actually it was exactly where we needed to be. In terms of being able to hit that target in April.
And
the issue that
Chris, how are you working with providers?
So the issue I think is that the scale of those kind of upcoming strikes represent a major challenge to delivering the target. So to answer your question, Helen, is we've been trying and I think succeeding, but obviously Owen and Patricia should comment. There are some things that we know we need to do nationally, which is having conversations with the unions, for example, about derogations, trying to ensure that we get an appropriate set of derogations to enable us to manage the impact of strikes. We've then been working very closely with ICBs in terms of doing, which one of the things I think we do really well in the NHS, is effectively doing that contingency planning to identify how we can support local leaders to manage the impact of the strikes. And I genuinely think so far we've done, I think, a really good job thanks to huge amounts of hard work. But we have lost 111,000 rescheduled appointments.
Thanks, Chris. So we are running really short of time. I do want to take the question from our virtual audience. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to apologise to Andy and Nadeem, but I'm sure that Chris and colleagues will take your question afterwards. So we take the question from the virtual audience, and I will ask the panel both to respond to that question and to add any closing words that you want to add, anything that you feel you want to get across the audience you haven't been able to say, or to respond to anything that your colleagues have said. So the question from the virtual audience is...
Thanks, Helen. This is from Steve Black. It says, everyone seems to agree that ICS and hospitals should have autonomy to make their own decisions and be trusted by NHSE to make those decisions without micromanagement. So how does this square with the announcement this morning that ICBs need to cut their management costs by about 30% over the next year?
Ooh, ouch. Patricia, do you want to kick off?
Yeah.
In both senses of the word, probably.
So I think that's an excellent question. And I think we my preference would be that we hang fire on implementing that decision, if I'm absolutely honest, until we understand what the Patricia Hewitt review is recommending and whether government accept it or not. Because I'm part of the review panel, I've been leading the work on population health and health equity, and I firmly believe that if we're going to move to a system which we've talked about over a period of time of a small number of national targets and then more local decision making with local priorities agreed with local communities, then we need to make sure that if we're committing to that with our communities, that we have the leadership and management infrastructure to deliver what we are committing to. So I think we just need to hold fire on that and see how it connects to the Patricia Hewitt review before we do anything rash. In terms of my wanting to think about the final comments for today, I absolutely believe that the partnership that we create, not just with system partners, but with the community more importantly, is absolutely critical if ICSs are going to be successful. And it links very much to the conversation earlier on about communicating with patients, in that I think we should be as transparent as we can actually with the public. I think the way that I said before, the Wigan dealers work proves that that is successful, that we trust the public to have sensible conversations about the way that public money is spent, and we work with them to prioritise what's important to them. So I think that's absolutely critical as we move forward. The one thing I would say as a final point is Owen talked about leadership, and leadership and the capability of leadership is really important, but it's also important what leadership looks like. And in the NHS, over 20% of our staff are from minority backgrounds. We've got similar numbers in terms of disability and the LGBTQ community, and yet our leadership does not reflect the people that we're here to lead, and it certainly doesn't reflect the communities that we're here to serve. So that's part of the partnership conversation, because if we want to lead with authenticity, authenticity also comes from representation. And of the 42 ICSs that exist in England, I am the only chief executive from an ethnic minority background, and that needs to change.
Yeah.
Patricia.
Yeah.
10 years ago, 10 years ago in an interview with the Nuffield Trust, David Nicholson said that one of the things he wanted to do as Chief Executive of the NHS Commissioning Board, NHS England, was to see more women leaders, broadly successful on that front, and more leaders from an ethnic minority background. I think there may be a bit of a way to go in that space. Chris, your brief final comments.
Okay, so just on the running cost allowance, so we all have an obligation, don't we, in a taxpayer-funded system to make sure we absolutely maximise money for taxpayers, for each taxpayer pound. That is why we at NHS England are currently engaged on a very significant restructure, which will enable us to devote significantly more amounts of the taxpayer pound to frontline care. As you might imagine, and this is a bit of a recurring theme, ministers do have quite a strong interest in the running costs of NHS organisations, and that is reflected in, for example, their interest in running cost allowance. So all I'm saying is that is part of working in the national system that we've talked about. In terms of where we are generally, as a sort of summary comment, I do think we're on a journey here. I think one of the things that is really clear was we've only just set up ICBs as statutory organisations. We certainly are feeling our way in terms of what the relationship should look like. Certainly my kind of sense is ICBs are feeling their way. I genuinely, from my seat, I feel we've been really clear about what it is that we want to do in terms of giving space to ICBs to lead. I think I've got a number of things that I've mentioned where I think I can, in a concrete way, point to the fact that we are doing things differently. But in the end, there's really not much point in me sitting here making promises. Judge us, as I said, on how we behave and what we do over the next couple of years. But we genuinely, as an executive team, are absolutely committed to doing it differently.
We might bring you back in a couple of years to hear how it's going. Owen, you get the very final words.
There's a bit of follow that in that. I will just go back to what Patricia said. This is my fourth chief executive role, 2 in local government, 2 in the NHS. It's very disappointing for me to think that throughout that tenure of nearly 20 years, you know, I'm still a leading light by virtue of my ethnicity. And you think, you know, it's great to get the applause about the point being made, but, you know, my worry would be that actually, you know, it's unusual to actually have two black chief execs of anything sat on a panel like this. And there's just a question for me about, you know, the applause are great. And everybody says, yes, we're going to do something about it, and is it wrong? But then, you know, somebody like myself, you know, is still a focal point for that very reason. And that doesn't feel right to me. And there's a couple of things as well I'd say which is slightly more broader. I would just be careful that we don't get seduced by what I call the days of ambrosia, that, you know, the suggestion that things used to be all right and they've really deteriorated. If you look at almost any metric pre-pandemic related certainly to the NHS, whether it's the money, constitutional targets, whatever else, and if you just go up to 2018 and you look at the direction of travel, it speaks for itself. You know, there used to be a time when, you know, the notion of spending 240 minutes in an accident and emergency area would have just been, no, that's not going to happen. But now we've got to a position where we've normalised that. And we can't allow ourselves to normalise that reality.
Absolutely.
Yeah? And the thing I always say about this, and it's one of the things why I'll always argue to my grave or my cremation, whichever it is when you get seduced by big numbers, I guarantee you that you are promoting health inequalities. Yeah? And so I would encourage you not to get seduced by big target numbers and all that sort of stuff, because history tells us that our most vulnerable people in society end up being on the wrong end of the stick of that type of thinking. So even though I know the language of health inequalities and tackling it is uncomfortable, I'm saying to you, certainly as far as I'm concerned, I'm not going to change my language and come up with different words. I want to help us move from health inequalities to health equity. But I want that for all of the people that we serve. And as I say, you know, the applause, the rah-rahs, now's the time for us to really knuckle down and show the leadership that is needed and required in the moment. And quite frankly, every one of us in here are leaders in one way, shape or form. And therefore, I think it's about time we don't always look to someone else to do that leadership. The first question I would leave us to asking, are I, you, we doing enough in that leadership space?
Fantastic point to think on. Finish on, Owen.
Yeah, great.
So, would you join me in thanking the panel for their contribution? And now my task is to hand over to Nigel. I think Nigel will say what he needs to say, but before he does, we've had one set of thanks already from Chris. I want to thank Nigel, and this is his last summit as our Chief Exec. It's not his last day as Chief Exec, we've got plenty of time to come, but it's an opportunity in front of you all and in front of our virtual audience to thank Nigel on behalf of the staff of the Nuffield Trust for everything that you've done for the organisation and the environment that you've created that has enabled our 50 staff now and all our staff in the past to give of the best that they can to make a difference for people who receive health and care services. So thank you from us.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Helen, very kind. Perhaps a practical, and thank you, Chris, for your kind words too. Perhaps a practical demonstration that perhaps you should think about management as an investment rather than a running cost, Chris. Might take I know you know that, but you might want to.
Well, we should think about health as an investment, shouldn't we, Nigel?
So, thank you, everyone. I hope you agree. It's been a really interesting, and we've managed to link things together. There's been a set of themes coming through. So, what we traditionally do now is we ask you to fill in your evaluation forms, and while we're doing that, I'll ask people perhaps to tell us one thing fairly briefly, if they could, that they want to take away from some of the very powerful things that we've heard, I mean, on this panel, a whole series of really interesting stuff, I think, and in fact, and in the previous one, and there was a lot of stuff yesterday, so try and just see if we could pull something out. But if you could fill in your forms if you're able to do that level of multitasking, that would be really good. Anyone, I could pick on someone, or someone could volunteer what's come through for you. One of the things that surprised me, come to Farsana here, if we could, that surprised me is the sort of focus on one of the themes that came through from my talk was about the management of anxiety in the system, and this someone else put it in terms of the illusion of control, trying to get control by collecting data. I think it was Richard Douglas. And the other thing was the importance of some of the basic systems management processes and how to get those right. That was really powerful. Absolutely. And I thought the first session this morning sort of spoke to the anxiety problem and really some really great stuff there. So Farsana, tell us.
Thank you, Nigel.
Stand up and tell us who you are.
Okay.
I know
hi, everybody. I'm Farzana, GP in East London. And you've stolen my thunder because I think the thing that came across for me was thinking about your session spoke to me most, diagnosing the NHS, and thinking about the NHS as an organisation that suffers from anxiety. I'd like to think as a clinician I'm quite good at dealing with anxiety in my patients, but actually thinking about it in those terms. And when I was reflecting on that, I think you were spot on with your diagnosis, because so many of the behaviours we see are just like the patient I'm treating with anxiety. So I think just knowing that is helping. I think the next step is now, how do we treat that?
Thank you. Good. Sylvia.
Sylvia Wyatt, Fellow of the Nuffield Trust. It's been fantastic 2 days. A bit of a shock to someone who's been outside the NHS for a bit. But two things. When I was working with Nigel before, we tried, or some trusts tried, to do the big bang approach to building something. It did not work in many instances. We ran something called the Future Healthcare Network. Actually, the incremental approach that's being advocated here is really, really good. And I think we can all take away small things that we can take forward. The other thing is that the richness of the conversations that we've had in the room has been due to the diversity of the people here. Cool. And I think that is something to be really valued and, if possible, extended.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sylvia. Heather here, I think.
Hi, I'm Heather Moorhead. I run the NHS Confederation in Belfast, and I think my reflections are really coming from the panel today is that we are so used to thinking as clinical leaders, NHS leaders, local government leaders, we're really stepping into a new paradigm of system leaders. And you could see the conversation tip yesterday as we thought about health, the creation of health rather than a sickness service, and the solutions coming with community and with government. So all of the bits that the people who will be really successful in making a difference, people who think of themselves as system leaders, managing all of that complexity. And I think that that's a better way to think, which will give us more access to more solutions. So that's my takeaway.
Thank you. Probably take one more if we've got one. Anyone else? Are you filling in your forms? I'm not seeing a huge amount of pens going on forms. Maybe you've... You don't get lunch unless you have filled it in. I didn't mention that. Nick Mazer's done his one. Was that also an invitation to say something, Nick? No, okay. Okay. Anyone else? No. Oh, Andy, go on. You missed out on the questions. Thank you.
Andy Cowper, Health Policy Insight. I'm just processing the revelation that NHS England is accountable for £140 billion of taxpayers' money.
I think that point was made, wasn't it? Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. So, I mean, really interesting. We have talked a bit about structures and processes and governance and policy, but a lot of what we talked about actually has been much more about the frontline experience of both staff and patients, about how you talk to communities, about rewriting the sort of the understanding of how we think about the staff, about different ways of communicating with patients. It is down in that sort of detail that came out of the map that I drew. So that was rather slightly unexpected but rather pleasing way that the conversation has gone on. So I'm hoping that we'll pick up these ideas, and that whoever comes after me will think that there's something worth pursuing there, and we'll feed it into the multiplicity of commissions. And I think there's a commission on the NHS being formed virtually every week, as far as I can see. There's a Times, there's the I think there's the BMJ have got one. There's another one, another independent one. So there's plenty of opportunities to take these ideas out. But I think a corrective to the idea that there is somehow out there some big bang solution that we just haven't quite thought of, and that instead the answer lies in the careful attention to a whole series of things across a wide range of different activities, some skilled leadership, some better management, addressing some of the issues that particularly Kevin and Alison raised about the way that staff's jobs are designed, different ways of having partnership with other parts of the system that a number of people have made points about. So there's lots to chew on and think about there. I should thank you all for your participation, and particularly for, I think we've had some fantastic panels. I mean, really astonishingly interesting and good contributions from them and from the speakers. And particularly thanks to Optum and MSD for their support for this, and to the BMJ for their work that they've done as our media partner over, I think, every single summit over the last 15 years. There's a bit of housekeeping, which is there are coaches to Egham and Slough. That's an inviting prospect, isn't it? I always remember John Betjeman at this point, and so there's that. The lunch will be next door. Martin gave his thanks to John Appleby last night. I'd like to add mine. He's been a fantastic colleague. I've worked with him in multiple of his incarnations. He's been part of making a difference to how the trust has operated, and helping to the big objective I've had is developing our staff and creating a real cadre of high quality researchers, and he's been a crucial colleague in helping to do that. He's also great fun to work with, as you might imagine. So he's leaving before me. He got in before me, but we will greatly miss him. So that's it. Thank you all very much. Thank you to the events team for their fantastic work, just brilliant, and all of that. And enjoy the rest of the day. Yeah. Brilliant. Yeah.